So if it's okay for you, we can start. Just a short presentation. Thank you very much, Fiona, to be here today. Just to give a short presentation. So originally from Dublin in Ireland, Fiona Ecarnot works as a research engineer at the cardiology department of the University Hospital of Besançon, in France. She received a Master of Science in Biostatistics and Epidemiology from the University of Franche-Comté, Besançon, and obtained a PhD at the same university in 2019 in the field of cardiovascular sciences, focusing on the use of qualitative research methods in the field of cardiology. She qualified as a director of doctoral research in 2024. Her research areas include vaccines, geriatrics and gerontology, ethics in healthcare, palliative care, and end-of-life issues. And she has authored or co-authored over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals, plus numerous book chapters. And thank you again very much for being here today.
No problem, and thank you all for joining me on the day that the summer holidays are starting. So you're all very courageous to be joining on a Friday afternoon. I hope I won't put you to sleep. So let me just share my screen. I hope you'll be able to see it. Okay. Okay. Is that okay for everybody? Can you see? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if I should stay here or if I should go on to the next, if I do that, has it moved to the next slide?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk today about writing a scientific article. This is something that is very difficult, especially for researchers at the start of their career who don't have much experience, because generally it's not something that's taught in, for example, master's programs or when you're at university. In any case, I personally never had any training in writing a scientific article, although we did have lessons in critical revision, critical reading of the literature, but that doesn't necessarily teach you how to write yourself. So sometimes it can be a bit daunting and you're like in front of a white page and you don't know where to start. So we're going to look today in particular at the standard format of a medical article. I'm kind of presuming here that you're all in medical disciplines for your doctorates. Maybe that's not correct. What kind of areas are you all working in?
NDT, non-destructive testing, and geophysics. And,
okay, so
engineering.
Okay, engineering. Okay, well, you may find that the order of the sections in articles in your areas may be slightly different, but in any case, the content will definitely be the same. So we're going to look at the format that's applied in medicine, but you can move the sections around according to what's required in your own disciplines, okay? So the standard format in medicine is what we call IMRAD, so Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. It's very straightforward, and there are pretty strict rules about what goes in each section, and then you can move them around, and each section remains a whole block, and you can move them around quite easily. So in the introduction, you're going to say why you did it and what your aim was. In the methods, you have to say exactly what you did, how you went about doing what you intended to do. The results is for what you found only, no discussion or anything like that. Usually you just put the results and leave it at that. And then in the discussion, you discuss it. What does it mean? How does it compare to the literature? How is it going to change practice? You know, have you reinvented the wheel, or what's so important about your research? So first of all, the introduction. In the introduction, you have to explain what motivated you to do this study, and you have to specify your exact objective. So there can be a working hypothesis and an aim, or they can be formulated in one single sentence. You should describe briefly how you went about this, but when I say briefly, I mean, for example, in a randomized trial, we investigated. Okay, you don't need to go into the details. But mostly the introduction is about underlining why your study is important and interesting and how it will add to the existing literature on the subject. So the general structure is that you start with what is widely known. For example, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in the world, okay? And then you narrow it down to what we do not know. However, it is unknown whether patients with heart failure fare worse than patients with heart attack. Okay, you narrow it down from broadly, this is the subject, but in particular within that subject, there's this area where there's a gap. And the whole point of the introduction is to say how your study is going to fill that particular gap. And that's why you will say, my hypothesis, or we therefore hypothesize that if you treat patients with a heart attack with drug X, they will get better. Okay, basically that's it. And then you state your objective. So our objective was to test drug X against drug Y to see if survival is longer, or whatever objective you have in mind. Okay, so that's basically the format. Broadly what is known, narrow it down to what's not known, and identify the gap in the literature that your study will fill. In the background section, you should be able to provide enough information to justify why you're doing this study. You don't have to cite every single paper in the whole literature, and you don't have to cover the whole field. You have to stay on your particular topic. And in that regard, you must take careful account of the type of audience that you're aiming for. And this will depend on the journal that you're thinking of submitting to. Okay, because if you're aiming for a journal that's widely read among specialists in a very specific area, they don't need to be told what cancer is. Okay, if you're talking to specialists from a very particular area of molecular oncology, they're looking for details about the finest points of 2 different chemotherapy molecules. You don't need to say to them, cancer is a very common disease. Okay, that's far too general for their purposes. But if you're talking to general practitioners or a mixed audience of specialists, general practitioners, maybe researchers in other fields, and maybe even the lay public, then you may have to pitch your article at a different level, because they will require a bit more explanation of some things that may be perfectly obvious to a specialist. Okay. Now, the introduction, of course, should convince the readers that you know your subject well. Don't say stupid things. I know that sounds really basic, but sometimes you read articles and they have the most outrageous statements, and you think, my goodness, how can they expect to be taken seriously when they say such stupid things? So stay on the topic and sound like you know what you're talking about. Okay. And then there's this famous gap in knowledge that we're trying to fill with the study. So the explanation of what is known within that area, what is not known, that will logically introduce this gap in the knowledge, that is really important to change medical practice or to move the general consensus of opinion forwards towards a new state of knowledge. Okay, so that can be helpful. For example, if you're able to say, by discovering which treatment is best for patients at high risk of, or with pulmonary embolism at high risk of mortality, then we will be able to change the recommendations, where currently this treatment is not recommended. If we have a randomized trial that proves that it's useful, then it can be recommended. Sometimes you're able to say what concrete implications will follow on from your study. So then at the end of the introduction, where you've stated what is known, what is less well known, what is the exact gap that you want to fill, what's your hypothesis, and then your objective. You must formulate your main objective explicitly. So think carefully about how you're going to phrase it and choose one way of saying it, and use the same sentence throughout the article in all the different sections. So you will use the same formulation, possibly words from it in the title, in the abstract, at the end of the introduction, and also in the discussion and in the conclusion. Okay, so we investigated whether drug X prolongs survival in patients with this type of cancer at stage 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. So it should contain all the elements of the population, the intervention, the outcome, and use the same formulation throughout. And bear in mind that in a medical article or in a scientific article of any type, repetition is not a bad thing. Repetition is good, because it shows at least that we're coherent, we're talking about the same thing all the time, and that you know what you're talking about. Because sometimes it can lead to confusion. If you use interchangeable words, people wonder if they have a different definition. So think carefully about your phrasing, choose one formulation, and keep the same one throughout. Okay? You can briefly mention the type of study that you're going to implement to address the question, just by saying, for example, a randomized study or a flow cytometry study, and basically in the population. But that's not the place to go into details. The introduction is just a brief mention of the strategy, but you don't detail it there. Now, a common question I have about how to write is what tense should we use? How do I write? In the present, in the future, in the past tense? But when you're talking in the introduction, you should use the present to describe current knowledge. So cancer is a common disease. When you're talking about previously published results, you'd use the past tense. So Jean-Pierre Foucault demonstrated that, okay? Drug X did not prolong survival. Fine. For something that started in the past but is not yet finished, you can use the present perfect. So several have investigated, but it is not yet clear whether. Okay. Now these are questions that really we don't need to deal with anymore, because now you can just stick your sentence into ChatGPT and it will tell you if it's correct or if it needs correction. So we don't need to focus so much on that, because you don't actually have to do it yourself anymore. Also, for things that have not yet happened, you still use the present perfect. And for the formulation of the hypothesis, you hypothesized in the past tense that such and such a thing increases or will increase present or future. Okay, so I won't delay on that, because these are things that you can now correct with AI. So it's not as important as it used to be. So once you've introduced your subject, convince the reader that you know exactly what you're talking about, that there's a major gap in the knowledge that you're going to fill with this revolutionary study. Now you have to explain what you did. Okay, so the second section in a medical article is always the methods. In other areas, sometimes the results come after the introduction and the methods go at the end, but it doesn't matter what order you put them in. In the methods, you have to explain in detail exactly what you did, the type of study, the type of population. Who did you study? Was it people? Was it animals? Was it tissues? Was it cells, etc.? Okay. Now, there are important differences between retrospective and prospective studies. In a retrospective study, you have to start with a description of the source data, how you chose them, so inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the number of patients or files or cells or animals or whatever that you studied, okay? It's a method in a retrospective study because you decided how many you were going to choose, okay? If you're doing a prospective study, or if you did a prospective study because you're going to be writing at the end, the prospective nature of the thing meant that the number of people you accrued is actually a result, okay? You will start with a description of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, who you wanted to include, and then how many of those you actually had at the end is a result. And therefore, it should not be in the methods if your study was prospective, okay? So, in the methods, you have to specify what you measured and, if necessary, why, especially if there are things that may be slightly unusual. You can use subtitles in the methods, for example, demographic data, angiographic data, procedural data, an explanation of the tools that were used, and also you must detail your statistical methods, all the tests that you performed, for which types of variables, and how you verified the conditions of applications of the test. If you use a multivariable model, you should specify what kind of model and how you selected it, forward, backward, stepwise selection, what were the thresholds for entry and exit into the model, what kind of software did you use, and what was the significance level that you chose, because there may be multiple comparisons and you may have adapted your significance level because of the multiplicity of statistical tests. If any of you have questions, please just interrupt, because I may not see if you raise your hand, or you can keep your questions to the end. But in any case, don't hesitate to stop me if you have a question, okay? So as I was saying, there are different things to put in a retrospective study report compared to a prospective study report. So in the methods for a retrospective study, you'll have the subjects, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, so the actual number of subjects, because you decided that, that's a method. Also, you have to put an ethics section about how you obtained informed consent and whether you had ethics approval for your study, the type of data that you recorded, the source data that you used, if there were any subgroups or sub-analysis of any type, the number of patient samples that you finally had, and the primary and secondary endpoints, and of course the statistical analysis. In a prospective study, you will do the inclusion and exclusion criteria for your subjects, the population description, the same about informed consent and ethics approval, the types of data that you recorded, the variables that you recorded and where they came from and how you measured them. If it was a randomized trial, you should note if there was registration of the study on a trial website anywhere, such as clinicaltrials.gov. If you did a randomized trial, you will also need to include a section about the calculation of the sample size, the statistical hypotheses that underpinned your calculation of the sample size, the error that you allowed, and how many you calculated to be needed in the end. You should also describe your randomization procedures if it was a randomized trial, the exact interventions that were implemented in your study, and again, the primary and secondary endpoints and the statistical analysis. So, again, from the point of view of grammar, we won't delay too much on this because the tense, you can now check that with ChatGPT easily, but don't give too much detail in the methods. If a method has been described and published elsewhere, then just put the reference. For example, we measured BMI according to Smith's method, and then you just put the reference in brackets. If you yourself have published a protocol of your study, then you really can reduce the methods practically to zero. You can just cite your own publication and say, the methods of this study have previously been described elsewhere. Bang, you put your reference in parentheses, and that's it. Briefly, we included patients with a recent less than 48 hours heart attack and over 75 years of age. That's basically it. You can reduce it very much if you've published a protocol elsewhere. Because all of this is what you already did, it should be in the past tense. And the past perfect tense if it's to describe things that happened even before you did your study, okay? But, you know, the tense, you can now get that corrected quite easily with AI. The most important thing in the methods is to make sure that everything you describe in the methods has the corresponding result in the results section and vice versa. You cannot talk about anything in the results or the discussion if it was not mentioned in the methods. For example, if you describe everything in great detail and then all of a sudden in the methods it says, well, inter-rater agreement was very high. Well, how do we know? You never said anywhere in the methods that you were going to test inter-rater agreement. So make sure that everything that you did is described and that you have one result for a method and vice versa. Then once you've described what you did, you can move on to the results where you're going to describe what you found. The result of the aim of the results section is really just to describe the factual results. In general, in medicine, in any case, there is no discussion, there's no comment, there's no judgment. So don't put in any words like surprisingly or contrary to what we expected, none of that. There are some disciplines where the results and discussion sections are mixed. So the title of the section will be results and discussion, and you will put the result and then the discussion of that result. And each paragraph will follow that format. But that's quite rare in medicine. So unless it's specifically described as such in the journal that you're aiming for, you should not do that. You should separate the results and put only the facts and then keep the discussion for the separate discussion section. You should not go back over the methods. So when you start to say, we found that the quality of life score was on average 25, we used this score and it has 7 dimensions and each dimension has 3 items. That's methods. That should be in the methods section. When you're describing the result, you just put the average score on the QOL instrument was 25. End of story. You don't need to go over the methods and you don't need to get into the discussion. You also don't need to interpret your findings. You don't need to say this is lower than the general population. The results is not the place for that, okay? As I said about the methods, make sure that for every result you present, you have the corresponding method in the method section. To make it easier for the reader, you should follow the same order of presentation in the presentation of your results that you used in the presentation of the methods. So you should start with the population, and then the inclusion, that will be the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then you will say the interventions that you did, and then you'll go on to maybe the multivariable model to identify predictors of death, okay? In the results, then you'll do the same. You say we had X number of people, there were average age, this % of men, and this is the data that we found, 25% had hypertension, 50% had diabetes, whatever. And then in the multivariable model, these were the predictors of death, okay? That should follow the same order. And there again, you can use the same subtitles that you had in the methods. As I was saying at the beginning, repetition is not a problem, okay? Repetition is good, makes it easier to read. So typically you'll have in your results a paragraph that will start with a recall of the topic or the intervention, the exact results, and you can refer to the tables and figures. We included 25 patients, average age 19 years. The demographic characteristics are displayed in table 1, okay? You may want to give an indication of the meaning. You may want to say survival was 6 months with drug X and 9 months with drug Y, suggesting that drug Y had a greater effect or had an effect on survival, but it's not mandatory, okay? And it depends sometimes on the journal whether they will accept that or not. And as for the methods, usually you will use the past tense for the results, okay? Because this is what happened. When you did it, you found this result. Oh, sorry, went a bit fast there. Sometimes in the results, students ask, what is the best way to present? So text is the best way to present if you can describe the result easily in 1 or 2 sentences. You should use a table for the information that is repeated in 2 or more groups. So if you have, for example, survivors and patients who died, and you want to show the age in both groups and the percentage of diabetics in both groups, a table is perfect for that. You can have a column for each group and the same variables across several groups, okay? Figures are more appropriate for data where individual data points are not informative. You need to see a trend or you need to see block results in a group, okay? Now, most journals will have a limit on the number of tables and figures that you can use in an article. So make sure that, you know, you check the instructions for the journal that you're aiming for. Do not repeat in the text any information that appears in the tables and figures. So if you have table 1 with the demographic characteristics and it says age, average age 70 years with, I don't know, standard deviation of 10, diabetics 25%, hypertensives 25%. Don't put that in the text, okay? If it's in the table, that's enough. One place is enough for the information. And also make sure that the figures in the text are the same as the figures in the table and the figure and in the illustrations, okay? Because sometimes, because of rounding, you may have 25 here and 26 there. Just make sure that it's the same everywhere. Also, you need to follow the journal's specific instructions for formatting because every journal has its own way of doing tables. But in general, for tables, you shouldn't leave empty lines and you shouldn't put too many lines and grids in the middle. Basically, just leave it all white. Most journals don't like there to be colors and lines everywhere. So check the journal's instructions for that. So this is an example of a good table. Okay, we have the intervention group, the usual care group, and the total. Sometimes you'd also have maybe a column with the p-value for the comparison between the two. You can see that there's the race, and then it's indented to show the different modalities in that group. And for each variable, it shows you the form of presentation of the results. So the first one is percentage, age is in years, etc. Okay. This is a bad table. Far too much empty white space. Okay. This whole column here on the right, there's only one variable in it. So that's the kind of thing typically that you would remove that whole section and just put that result in one line in the text because you absolutely don't need it. You can't have half the page all white like that. Journals do not like to publish empty pages, okay? They don't make money from empty space. So this kind of table is definitely a no-no. This is a good figure, okay? You can clearly see that the number at risk is given at the bottom. Both axes are labeled with a legend. You can see the two curves clearly, and it also shows which group corresponds to which curve. And then we have the result of the statistical test stuck there in the middle, okay? This one, not so much, okay? You can't see anything. The scale is far too big. All the values here are crunched between 0 and 5, but the scale goes up to 30. And then at the bottom, the curves are superposed, so you actually can't see anything at all, okay? You can't distinguish the groups between gallbladder, ampulla, whatever. You can't distinguish them because they're all on top of each other. If you spread it out over a scale on the y-axis from 0 to 5, it would probably be much more visible. Okay. So once you've said what you did and why and how and what you found, the next section is the discussion. This is where you have more liberty to, you know, say what you think yourself. The other sections are very factual and stick to quite strict rules about the presentation. The discussion is an area where you have more free rein to discuss it and put it in perspective. But most importantly, you have to situate your results in relation to the other available literature in order to show how you have moved the state of science forwards with your article. Otherwise, you have no novelty value and the journal won't accept your work for publication. So the aim is to interpret what your results mean as a whole and how they are significant and useful. Okay. In brief, the discussion should always start with a one-sentence reminder of your main finding. This study showed that drug X prolongs survival in patients with stage 4 breast cancer. Okay, just as an example. You then have to interpret your observations, compare them to the literature, say what's new in your findings. Maybe you saw that, one particular group did particularly well or not so much. In the discussion, you will also list your strengths and limitations to show that you're aware of what possible biases exist and how this may limit the interpretation of your results. You should also say whether your results are generalizable to other populations or contexts. And of course, there's that famous gap in the knowledge that we wanted to fill. So you should now say, did you fill your gap in knowledge? And why is it important that you did so? Can we now move towards a consensus that drug X should be avoided or that drug X is definitely beneficial? And then how will your results affect clinical practice? What are the clinical implications or practical implications for people working in your area? And if there's anything that your study kind of threw up as an interesting idea, maybe you will have some ideas for future research that might help to clarify certain issues that came to light in your study. So you're going to start with a brief summary of your main finding. And here again, you will use the exact same formulation that you used in the abstract and in the introduction. In the discussion, you don't just repeat the results, you have to really interpret them. Okay, so if your aim was to test the safety of drug X, you will discover that after administration of drug X, 20 out of our 25% of our 25 patients experienced intracranial hemorrhage. Now, this does not mean that 80% of patients who are treated with drug X will develop a hemorrhage. That is not the correct interpretation. You should say rather that your results indicate that administration of drug X may lead to intracranial hemorrhage, may have serious adverse consequences in a majority of patients. But you have to be very neutral and careful in your interpretation of your results. Don't go overboard. Don't get carried away, okay? You should put your results in perspective with other findings in the literature, explain anything that is particularly interesting or surprising. As I was saying, don't overinterpret or misinterpret. If there are any negative results, you can explain maybe why you found that. For example, if you test cognitive function and you don't find any result, you don't find any significant change in cognitive function after your 12-week intervention doing cognitive training, perhaps you could say that the overall level of education in your group was unexpectedly high, that most of the participants had a university education and therefore had a very high level of cognitive function at the outset. So there was very little for them to gain. And that if you had included more people with a lower cognitive function at the outset, there would have been more possibility for them to show a significant improvement. Okay, so you have to try and explain why you found what you found. And why is this important? That could mean, for example, that implementing interventions for cognitive function in people who have a university education is pointless. Well, it's a waste of money because there is too little to be gained for them. If you did several analyses or several interventions, you should explain how they hang together. And not only the individual analysis, but for example, if you do mindfulness and exercise, you can say that overall it reduced anxiety and improved physical function. So overall, quality of life was better. You have to try and explain what the overall context is and how all of these things work together to make an improvement. An important point when you're discussing your results is the comparison with other studies in the literature. Now, you can describe results reported by other authors to put your results in context. That's not a problem. Everybody does that. That's fine. You can state that your results were higher, lower, similar, different. That's okay. But you must be careful to be diplomatic when you're commenting on other people's work, because remember that these people may be potential reviewers of your work. Okay? You should concentrate on your own study's strong points rather than pointing out weaknesses in other people's work. Okay? And you should also try to avoid all or nothing formulations, like you'd say, their study was all wrong. You can't say that, because if the guy who wrote it is reviewing your work, he will not be very impressed, okay? So just be careful when you're stating, others have shown that, it was reported that. I usually just take the sentence from the conclusion of the abstract. That's usually a very good summary of what was found in another paper. So you go on PubMed, you find the citation, copy the line from the abstract, and you just basically put that more or less word for word, and then you're sure that you haven't deformed any message in passing. And also you can say things like, our study had a total of 50 patients. You don't need to say that the other guy only had 10, because anybody who looks at the reference will then see that you had 50 and he only had 10. Okay, so you can just say what you did, and if it compares favorably, the reader will understand that, and you don't have to actually say it in so many words. Okay, always use formulae of attribution. Give others credit for their work. So don't just say other authors. You can say Smith and collaborators, because that, then if it's Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith who's reviewing your work, they will be very happy to see their name cited. The next to last paragraph, so the one immediately before the conclusions, should be a paragraph dedicated to the limitations of your study. You should not start the discussion with your limitations, okay? Don't open your discussion by saying, our study has several limitations. It was small and we only had a few interventions and there was very high missing data. Don't do that, because the person who's reviewing just won't go any further, unless the journal specifically instructs that you should do that, but very few journals ask you to do that. So always put the limitations at the end, just before the conclusions. Showing that you are conscious of your limitations can help to diffuse critique from the reviewers. It can also, maybe get ahead of any potential comments that the reviewers may have. It may help them to understand and say, oh yes, well, I see, they actually did think about that. So yeah, maybe it's not so bad after all, okay? And it gives you an opportunity to explain why it may not be such a limitation after all, because sometimes the reviewers think something is really a major limitation, but it may not be. You may also want to discuss the implications of your results. Okay, how are you going to change practice? How have you moved the state of knowledge forwards? And if your results have brought to light anything particularly salient, how should we change practice to take account of this? Try to avoid speculation. You should not say anything that is not directly supported by a result from your study. And the same goes for the conclusion. Don't conclude about things that were not an objective of your study. So that's basically all there is to say about the main sections, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Now we're going to look quickly at the title and abstract. The abstract is a showcase for your article. It has a similar format, so it'll have a short background, methods, results, and conclusion, but no discussion and no references. And it's really a key marketing tool, because I'm a managing editor of a journal. For most papers, I reject on the abstract. I can tell from the abstract already if it's going to be something that's worth reading or not. So it's really very important to work hard at your abstract and make it clear, concise, and interesting. It should be independent insofar as from the abstract, I should be able to see why you did, what you found, and what it means, okay? And I shouldn't have to look in the main text to get any more details. The background should be 2 to 3 sentences. Overall, an abstract is generally 250 words. That's 1 page, double-spaced, okay? It's very short. So the background will be 2 to 3 sentences. You describe the context and the rationale, your gap in knowledge, and the objective. That's all. In the methods, generally for the methods, you will stick to a description of the main outcome. So you will only say what methods were related to your main primary outcome and the endpoint that goes with that. So the population, the intervention or treatment that you implemented, and what was your endpoint. And then the main results. Use means and summary data, but you can't put any illustrations, okay? Make sure that you do put a result for every method. That's also valid for the abstract, the same as in the paper. And you must make sure that you give enough results to support what you're going to put in the conclusions. Then in the very short conclusion section, you will say something like, our study shows that drug X prolongs survival in breast cancer patients. That's about all that you will have room for. In a good abstract, it should clearly identify the gap in knowledge. It should clearly state the main objective. It should give the main results with a method and a result paired, and a clear conclusion. You can understand it on its own, and it has no illustrations or references, except sometimes in congresses you can put in a figure, but mainly for an article you won't have anything to illustrate in an abstract. And really, it's excessively important because most of the time the editors in the journal won't go any further than the abstract. If the abstract is bad, your paper won't even be opened. And then the title. It's important to find an effective title because it has to contain the key points of your article. It should be attractive because you're hoping that it will give people the desire to read the full text. It should cover all the key points of the abstract, so the methods, the result, the conclusion. But it also has to be easy to find in PubMed. If somebody is searching for information about the use of drug X in stage 4 breast cancer, if the words stage 4 and breast cancer are not in the title, then nobody's ever going to find your article. Okay, so you should avoid fanciful titles and things that are too metaphorical or highfalutin, out there. Stay factual and stick to scientific words that make it clear. If possible, you should try to distinguish your work from other articles, but unfortunately that's not always possible because, basically everybody studies the same thing. So you're going to have to include the drug or intervention or test or whatever it is that you tested, the type of patients that you included, the design, and the main finding, okay? You should give it an idea of the direction of your result in the title. Like, don't put a question like, does drug X prolong survival? Well, I want to know from the title already, well, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't, but please indicate the direction of the relation. Another thing is always put the key aspects towards the beginning of the title, because sometimes titles can be truncated, so the important information should be at the beginning. And as I was saying, avoid imprecise phrases that don't give an idea of the direction. If there's an effect, say what it is. If there is a direction of the relationship, then state the direction of the relationship. Also avoid proprietary names. You should not use brand names in a title. You should always use the international non-proprietary names for drugs. And most journals don't allow subtitles. So spare those and check the journal instructions about the use of subtitles. Here are some examples of good titles. You can take any highly rated medical journal or journal in your field and look at the titles to see what kind of things they put in. Also note that many journals impose a maximum length for the title, which can make it very hard to come up with something catchy that contains all the important information. So check the journal for examples and for instructions. Now, the last word about the article is about the references. References are an important illustration of the robustness of your research, and it shows that you know what you're talking about and that you have adequately reviewed the field in the area of your research. It's your responsibility to check that any references you cite are correct. And it's imperative that you check all of the references that you cite. You can't leave it up to other people to make sure that the references are correct. Okay, the references put your work in context with other studies in the same field, and they're also helpful for readers who want to, read up more on the subject. So you should always try to include key references in your field so that people who are interested in the topic can find other good material. Now, when do you need a reference? Well, obviously, something that you take from somewhere else should have a reference. Universal truths don't need to be referenced, like cancer is a very common disease. Okay, we really don't need a reference for that. Okay, but if you use, for example, something that has a name that somebody gave it, like the Charlson Comorbidity Index, you'll have to put the reference for that. Katz's Activity of Daily Living, you have to put a reference for that. And also, if you say, for example, other authors have shown, well, then you're definitely going to have to put in a reference to those other authors. Okay. You can preferentially cite articles that are published in peer-reviewed English language journals that are cited in PubMed. That's the highest level. Books can also be cited, but you must name the book and the editor and also the individual chapter title and the author of the chapter and the page on which the information you are citing is to be found. Next down, you can cite websites for things like laws, legislation. Usually websites are the only source. And then at the very bottom of the list, personal communications and unpublished data should be avoided. You should, in choosing your references, give priority to the most credible. That means the highest quoted journals, and the most recent. If you have 2 articles on the same topic, you should choose the more recent of the 2. You should also prefer original research over reviews and meta-analyses, where there can sometimes be loss of granularity because of the fact that the data is grouped. So how do you cite a reference? Well, usually the easiest way is to use a reference management software. You should follow the instructions of your target journal regarding the reference format, bearing in mind that if you don't format your article correctly when you're submitting it, it may be desk rejected. That means rejected immediately without even going as far as the editor, and definitely not going as far as the reviewers, okay? So make sure that you do what the journal instructs regarding the reference format. And if you're reading and you find interesting references, note them or put them in your reference management software as you go along, because otherwise you say, oh yeah, I'll come back to that, but you won't, because you won't remember, because you see so many references that it's impossible to remember them all. It's your responsibility to check the accuracy of all references, especially, I would say, those that you take from another article. So if you're reading a meta-analysis and it says Smith and collaborators showed that 25% of people had diabetes. Okay, don't just take their word for it. You look at the reference, you go and get that paper, and you verify that that is really what Smith and collaborators did say, because sometimes some authors may transform things a little bit, or they may have misunderstood, they may have misread a line. It's very often that errors are propagated in that way because nobody checks. So if you read something and it has a reference, check that reference before you use it yourself. So that's how to write an article in a nutshell. Then you've written your article, you submit it to a journal, you follow the instructions, you go to the submission site, you submit, and then what happens next? Well, before we go on to this, does anybody have any questions about the writing, or do you want to keep the questions for the end?
Hello. I have some questions.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Damiano. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was a lot to digest, and some bits or advice I already heard from my supervisor, but not all in one place condensed, so very useful. Also, as I think most of the audience today, we are in engineering, yes, so we are not maybe used, especially for the methodology or like the results section. It was something also new to learn how, yeah, let's say publication in medicine work, or let's say yeah, exist. So I had a question more regarding like the differences between like results and discussion. How can you avoid to make any association between, like, if you have a figure, for instance, and you want to use that figure in your result, you start describing your result, and then in the discussion you should reference again that figure, or you should just assume that the reader already saw that figure before because it was in your results section, and then in the discussion you can say, as we saw previously, in this plot, we can then, I don't know, infer or deduce that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, usually, as you say, you can assume that the reader has read. If they're at the discussion, you can assume that it's because they read through everything from the beginning up to the discussion. So in theory, they're supposed to have read the results before they read the discussion. But some journals will allow you to cite the figure in the discussion. You can say, in our study, we saw that survival was significantly longer in patients who received drug X. And you can put in parentheses figure 4. That's okay. If the journal doesn't allow it, they will tell you to take it out. But most of the time, you can do that if you really want to highlight something. But in theory, as you say, the reader is supposed to have read the results, so they should remember, you know, but you can cite it. Okay. But just make sure that if you put figure 4 in the discussion, that you actually did call figure 4 in your results section. Yes. Don't refer to anything in the discussion that's not in the results. Okay, you can't do that. You must make sure that everything you discuss has already been mentioned in the results, and that everything you put in the results was announced in the methods. Okay? But yes, you can cite the figure in the discussion. That's okay.
Okay, because especially, at least in my field, let's say limitation, discussion, results section sometimes are a bit mixed, or like they don't follow the specific format. So
yeah, in some journals, in some fields, effectively, results and discussion are mixed. In that case, you don't need to cite because you're going to discuss it at the point where you give the result. So you can say, in this article, we can see that industrial procedure X produces 50,000 more units per hour than industrial procedure Y. And you can show a figure or whatever, or, you know, and then this indicates that we should widely use this in every factory in Italy or whatever. You can discuss it and compare all in the same paragraph. So you don't have the problem of citing the figure because you're discussing it at the same place that you introduce it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Any more questions before we move on? Yeah, Olga?
Yes, hi. Yes, my name is Olga, and my question is, sometimes in some journals, they have a very particular structure which they want us to follow. For example, I had once, they wanted me to have discussion section and then conclusion section, but I had a big problem to differentiate between discussion and conclusion, because, I mean, every time when I discuss something, usually I just kind of make a point, making a conclusion, not just to cut the discussion and then a conclusion in the other section. So my question was how to differentiate between these sections if we have to have both, and should I just repeat myself? I mean, to say it in discussion section and then repeat it in the conclusion section, but it's going to be all the same. I mean, I have a problem here and I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So many journals will have a specific conclusion section at the end of the discussion that will come after the paragraph about the limitations. In the conclusion, you should give a repeat of the sentence that you decided to use for your introduction. So in the introduction, you decided to phrase your overall objective in a specific way. We aimed to investigate whether drug X prolongs survival in breast cancer patients with stage 4 breast cancer, okay? So your conclusion is going to take that sentence and just turn it into a conclusion. This study showed that drug X prolonged survival in patients with stage 4 breast cancer. It's going to be just a summary, and it can be just a few short lines. You can say survival was particularly long in patients who were younger, or survival was not affected in patients who were taking another drug at the same time. You can give any secondary results that you found. The main thing about the conclusion is that you should not discuss. You should not say, we think that this is because, or this could be due to the fact that. There's none of that. It's a factual summary of what you found. If I said to you, well, what's the main result? What was your main finding? That's your conclusion. We found that overall, 75% of young adolescents don't know anything about sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, it's going to be just a one-line summary of what you found with no interpretation, no references, no new information. So you shouldn't say this is contrary to what Smith and collaborators already described with a reference. You don't put references or outside explanations in your conclusion. The conclusion will be very short and very factual. And you may want to include one line of maybe perspective. This indicates that we should implement public awareness campaigns about sexually transmitted diseases targeting adolescents in secondary school, for example. Okay, you may have just one line of kind of opening up to future perspectives in the conclusion. But the conclusion is different from the discussion in that you don't discuss, you don't interpret, you don't try to explain, or you don't put it in context. That you don't do that in the conclusion. You keep that for the discussion section, and the conclusion is really just a factual summary in 2 or 3 lines and one line of perspective. Okay, is the difference clear to you now?
I should probably check again my text to see how I did it, but yes.
Yeah, and you can always, if you have a question, a good thing to do is take a leading journal in your field. Take the top journal in your field, the one that you dream about publishing in. If you were to like make an instant success of your career by publishing in one journal, take that journal and look at an example. That's the easiest way to see the difference.
Yes, thank you. But the thing is, I mean, why I had a problem, because sometimes, and pretty often, to be honest, they don't separate between discussion and conclusion sections.
Yeah,
but
some journals don't. And if they don't, then that's okay. That's okay if you want to just stop at the end of your discussion. But it's nice for the reader at the end to have one line, even just at the end of your discussion. So you can say, in conclusion, our study showed that what? What is the main message that you want people to take home when they've read your study? If you have to present it in 2 minutes on television, what would you say? What do you want people to remember? That's what your conclusion should be. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions before we move along? No? Okay. Well then, let's keep going with what happens after you've written your article and submitted it to a journal. What's going to happen next? Yeah? Sure.
Regarding, can you go back to the slide where you talked about the abstract?
Yep. This one?
Yeah, so basically, just to clarify, so the abstract is a smaller article, let's say, taking
a miniature of your article. That's correct.
Taking into account that we have to respect, the same methodology for the paragraphs, and because I have seen also in my experience, or I have seen other colleagues, sometimes you write the abstract, and for instance, there is a conference and the abstract deadline is, let's say, is much earlier than the abstract, obviously, of the paper. So you have not reached some, let's say, results in your research or stuff. You're waiting for something. And so how do you feel, let's say, the methods, results, and conclusion paragraphs of the abstract if your research is still ongoing? Don't know if being clear with my question.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about, because I have had this situation many times. So it will depend a lot on the kind of conference that you're submitting to. If you're submitting to a very large congress where you have, for example, late-breaking science, you can submit an abstract as late-breaking science, and you can say results will be available at the time of the congress. If it's something that's highly anticipated by the scientific community, that you're doing the randomized trial that will answer the ultimate question and everybody is eagerly awaiting your results, then that may fly, that may be okay. But mostly, to be perfectly honest, if you submit an abstract with no results, it will not be selected for presentation. So the best you can do is to have, if you have access to your database, but maybe the evaluations or the statistical analysis is not complete, you should at least include the demographic information. You should be able to say how many observations you have. You should be able to give a brief description of your population. If you have 250 patients, you should be able to give their age, the percentage of people with risk factors for cardiovascular disease or whatever, risk factors for falls or whatever kind of population you have. You have to be able to give some information. An abstract is not an abstract if it's empty, okay? It's only an abstract when it has a results section with results in it, okay? Now, if, for example, you don't have the full results of your 3-month follow-up where you will discover whether your patients are dead or alive, okay, you can say that the primary analysis is, or the primary data collection is still ongoing and results will be available at the time of the Congress, but you should be able to at least give a description of the population.
Okay, so for instance, if you want to apply a certain methodology, you have started applying that methodology and you have the first results, you could put these first results into the abstract and say that further results will be available in the further
at the time of the Congress.
Whatever these results would be.
Yeah. Now, most of the time, journals won't hold it against you if you have published some of the data in an abstract form in a congress. You can't publish your data twice, but that means publications online or in journals. Preprints are usually acceptable. Abstracts in congresses are acceptable. So it won't be prejudicial to you to send an abstract with preliminary information about your study population to a congress. That's not a problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so let's go back to what happens when you've submitted and where to go next. So this is, so you've sent your article to a journal and they've sent you a reply. What do you do now? Well, the first thing to bear in mind that it's very rare for an article to be accepted immediately in the first round of review in the first journal that you submit to. That's practically unheard of, okay? So don't take a negative decision personally. It's not a reflection on you as a person. It's generally not even a reflection of your work. Usually journals just get so many articles that they just can't publish everything. That's all there is to it. So don't take it personally. Don't take it badly. It is what it is. That's the way. It's not a problem. Also bear in mind that the reviewers are your potential readers. They're people like you. They're experts. Generally, most of the time, they're well-intentioned. So if the reviewers did not understand what you were trying to explain, then it probably means that it wasn't clear enough. So don't think, oh, they're so stupid, they don't understand anything. No, they're average people. You sent your work to them and they read it and they don't understand. So maybe you didn't explain it so well. Okay, so take it kind of seriously and go back over it objectively and think, well, maybe it could have been clearer. In answering reviewers for resubmitting to the journal, there's no standard or reference method. Most journals don't even tell you how to format your responses. So it's up to each reviewer to say what they like, and there's no standard form or anything. So it can be very variable. Sometimes you get really long reviews that are very detailed. Sometimes you get like a one-liner that absolutely destroys you, and there's just no way you can answer. But don't take it personally. That's just the way it is. Increasingly, with open access publications, the reviewers' names are often known to the author and vice versa, which I personally think is a good thing, because reviewers tend to be more polite when they put their name on the review. You will see that the most critical reviews are generally anonymous. So this is the scale of possible responses that you can get from the journal, okay? Now, at the very bottom here, we have a definitive rejection. You may get what we call a desk reject, so it's rejected by the journal without undergoing peer review. That's the quickest. Sometimes that can be a good thing, because at least it means that you don't waste any time. You can get a desk rejection within 2 or 3 days. Okay, fine, it's not suitable for them, I'll submit elsewhere. You don't waste any time with that. Sometimes you get a definitive rejection with review. If that's the case, well, just take anything in the review that could be changed, that any pertinent comments, and maybe integrate them. Think about including them in a new version that you will submit to another journal. The next step up is a reject decision, but they invite you to resubmit de novo, so from scratch. Now, don't take this badly. It doesn't mean that your paper is really bad. Sometimes this is just a trick that journals use to improve their journal statistics, because that means that they have a lower acceptance rate because they have rejected more papers, and they have a higher submission rate because your paper will be considered as a new submission when it comes back the next time. So that's just a way of kind of playing around with statistics. It doesn't always mean that your paper is very bad. And then we have the revised decision. So within revisions, we have major and minor revisions. I actually should probably put these the other way around, because a major revision is more difficult to overcome than a minor revision. Major revisions usually require that you do new analysis, or that you change your analysis in some way, or that they might ask you to introduce new figures, new data, and that can require a lot of changes. For example, in the geriatrics journal that I'm the editor of, if there are 2 or 3 reviewers who all ask for changes, I always classify that as a major revision when I send the decision to the authors, because it's like a lot of work to be done. So it just is a reflection of the amount of work that needs to be done, really. Then next up the ladder is a minor revision. Usually that just means things like correcting the presentation of a figure, or adding a column to your tables, or making some grammatical corrections, or changing the order of paragraphs, or including new citations, something very minor that doesn't require you to change your analysis in any way. And then at the end of all that, there's acceptance. Usually you get to acceptance after having gone through the revision stage. So when you're preparing your responses to the reviewers, the first thing to do is decide if you want to pursue the revision or not, because when you get a decision from the journal, there may be an awful lot of work involved in doing the revisions. It may be more work than you have time to do. You may be in a hurry to publish the work and not able to spend time redoing all the analysis or collecting additional data, or they may require changes that you are not willing to make. So first of all, decide if you want to revise and resubmit or not. Now, I would always advise you to revise and submit. If you get the possible opportunity to do so, then you should pursue it. It's unusual to submit to a journal and then decide that you don't want to pursue with them if they give you the opportunity to revise. If that's the case, you should not have submitted to them in the first place, okay? So decide if you want to revise and then go ahead. Think about your responses for a while and let them mature in your mind. Don't respond in the heat of the moment, because it's always quite emotional when people criticize your work. Even if their critique is well-intentioned, you always take it kind of personally, but you have to let that emotional reaction pass and then think about it objectively and then respond. In any case, you should try to respond as soon as you can, and definitely before the deadline. If they say, please resubmit within 14 days, then you should, think about it for a day or two, but then get to work. If you need more time for the revision, contact the journal immediately to ask for an extension. Don't wait until the day of the deadline and then say, oh my God, I'm not going to get finished in time. I'm going to ask for an extension. Don't do that. That just shows that you are not organized. If you think that the volume of work involved will require more time than they gave you, then just write to them immediately and say, I need more time. Most journals don't care. They will give you an extension. There's no problem. They just want to be aware, okay? So just ask for more time and say that you will do it by whatever date, maybe 1 month or 6 weeks or whatever. You should also check the journal instructions in case they have a template. Sometimes they give instructions about how to reply, and particularly for resubmissions, be careful to note their instructions about whether to submit a clean version or a version that has the revisions shown in a different color or highlighted or whatever. So make sure that you check their instructions about that. If there are no specific instructions, no matter what, you should take the whole response letter, copy it into a file, and then put an answer for every single point. Even the compliments, even if it starts with, this is a really well-written paper, then you should say, thank you. That should be your response, okay? But make sure you answer absolutely everything. So here are some examples. For example, please list the factors that influence blah, blah, blah. Okay, thank you for pointing this out. It said there were 6 and there are only 5 listed. So thank you for pointing that out. We have now corrected, okay? You consider mostly the EU and Europe. What about the rest of the world? Okay, thank you. You're right. We've now introduced this in the discussion, okay? Oh, sorry, went too fast there. One very important thing is to avoid we thank the reviewer for his comments. You shouldn't do that, because unless you're 100% certain that it's a man, you should prefer the reviewer, or we thank the reviewer for their comments or for your comments, but don't say his or her comments, because reviewers are reviewing voluntarily. They don't get paid. They're taking the time out of their work to do this. And if it's a lady and she gets called his comments, she won't be pleased, okay? So your paper is going to go down to the bottom of the list. So try to be neutral. Make sure that you have an answer for every single comment, even the compliments, and indicate where you made the changes. Now, there's a debate about whether or not you should include the text that you've changed. I don't do it generally unless the journal requests that you do so. It's up to you. You can put in, we have now reformulated as follows, and then you can put in the new text. But one thing is for sure, do not repeat in the responses any text that you have removed. If they say, please remove the sentence, then just say, this sentence has been removed. Don't repeat it, because if they're asking you to take something out, it's because they don't like it. There's no need to put it under their nose again a second time. Just say it's gone. Forget about it. Thank you. We've done that. Okay. Did I lose the microphone there?
Yeah, for a second, but now it's back.
Okay. So it's okay to say that you don't agree with the reviewer's comments, but you must say why, and you should be polite and diplomatic. We agree with the reviewer's assessment that the rate of inclusions was low. However, we would like to point out that this is not a problem because whatever. So it's okay to say that you don't agree, and you can keep your line. We have chosen not to delete the figure because we feel that it illustrates X, Y, Z. Just be polite and say your point of view. The reviewers are not God. They're not the be all and end all. The ultimate decision lies with the editor. So if there is something that you don't want to do, you can refer to the editor's discretion. For example, if a reviewer asks you to remove a figure and you don't want to, you can say, we have chosen not to remove the figure, but we leave it to the editor's discretion. If the editor feels it's necessary, we would be willing to do it. Always say that you're willing to do it if the editor decides. That way, you kind of bypass the reviewer's authority, okay? Another kind of psychological trick that works very well is the last comment of the reviewer. Bearing in mind that during the revision process, each reviewer reviews and they send their comments. When you submit your revised version, it goes back to those reviewers, but each reviewer will only look at the comments they made themselves. They don't usually check whether you responded to the other reviewer's remarks. So with that in mind, the last comment from every reviewer should be answered positively. Always try to do the last thing that the reviewer suggests, okay? It doesn't matter if they say, please say that black is white. Fine, if you want. We now say that black is white. That's okay. Just do it, okay? Because it will leave a positive impression with them. The reviewer will have an overall impression that you did what they asked. If you answer the last positive comment, they will think that you answered everything positively. So always try to make sure that you do the very last thing they asked you to do, okay? Here are some examples for ways to begin a reply to a critical comment. We agree, but, you are right, but, although we agree, no, okay? These are some examples of good ways to remain diplomatic when you're pointing out that you're not going to do what they asked, basically. In your revision, you should always display the changes unless the journal asks you to just submit a clean version. You should never change the authors during the revision. In any case, most journals don't allow you to do that, or if they do allow you to do it, you'll probably have to sign a lot of forms. So you should make sure that you decide on your authors before the original submission and then don't change. Also, do not change anything that nobody commented on unless you discover a factual error, like you got the percentages wrong or something. But don't change anything that nobody commented on. So if the reviewers didn't say anything, just leave it. Don't change anything else. Please also make sure that you do not leave any comments in the margin of your paper. Comments like, this reviewer doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay, if the reviewer sees that, they're not going to accept your paper. So make sure that you delete all comments and do not leave any especially disparaging comments in the margins. If the editor or the reviewers ask you to reduce the length of your paper, you should try to reduce the background and the discussion, not the methods or the results. For the methods, you can take out sections and put it in the supplementary material, and the same for the results. But try not to reduce them. You should always try and get the information out there. However, you will see that the background can be reduced practically to 2 paragraphs. So you can cut out the background and you can reduce the discussion, but try not to reduce the methods or the results. And the last point to look at is what to do in difficult situations. For example, if you have two reviewers and one asks you to say black is white and the other asks you to say black is grey. Okay, what do? They're asking me to do two different things. I can't do both. Well, the easiest way to do it is choose whatever suits you best. If you agree with one and not the other, then go with that one. That's fine. But just respond accordingly. And also, you should point out that, well, since one reviewer asked you to do X, but the other reviewer asked you to do Y, you can only do one of the two. So you've chosen to do X because you have the available data, or because it's more coherent with your situation, or the application of your intervention or your study or whatever. Just explain why. And also, you should explain in the cover letter to the editor, which usually is not shown to the reviewers. You should explain in your letter to the editor why you chose to follow one suggestion rather than the other. Now, what you should do if reviewers are plainly wrong, well, if they say you didn't include the average age and the average age is there, well, sometimes what I do is I highlight it as if it was a change and say the age is now shown at the beginning of the results. It was actually there the first time, but they didn't see it. Okay, that's fine. But then you just put it in as if it was new. Or you can say politely, in fact, this information was given in the results section in the third paragraph. You can say, perhaps it wasn't sufficiently clear. We've moved it to the beginning of the paragraph to make it more obvious. Or if the reviewer says, well, actually, you should say that, you know, cancer is not a leading disease in the world and it kills very few people. You can say, well, with all due respect, we believe that the current state of the literature shows that cancer is a very deadly disease, and you can put in a few references. And there again, you should explain to the editor in your cover letter that you feel that the reviewer's point is not substantiated by the existing literature and that you believe that your assertion is correct. And finally, sometimes you just get reviews from people who are rude, who are biased, who are derogatory, who are demeaning. Well, there are stupid people out there. There's nothing you can do about that. You can just say to the editor, you can, first of all, in your responses, you can say, we regret that the reviewer didn't appreciate our work. We thank you for the time spent reading our article. Just leave it at that. But you should put a word in the letter to the editor to say that with all due respect, and you respect the fact that the reviewers are doing this work voluntarily without, you know, not getting paid for it, but still the tone is unacceptable, that you cannot accept personal criticisms or, you know, a demeaning tone, and that you would be grateful for another round of review with a new reviewer who may have a more open or unbiased point of view. So basically, if there are any issues with the reviews, the best thing to do is just refer to the editor, because that's the editor's job. If you also feel that, you know, the reviewers were wrong, there again, just call on the editor. The editor is the ultimate decision maker. If the editor turns you down, well, that's the end of it. But definitely you can bypass the reviewers and call on the editor's discretion to resolve any issues that may arise during the review process. In general, you know, like the journal is always benevolent. Journals generally, when they put articles into review, are hopeful that they will reach priority for publication. Usually when I send articles for review, it's because I think that, you know, they might actually be a good fit for the journal, unless a specific expert in the area tells me, no, well, really, it's not good quality. I can't be an expert in everything. So journals are there to help you. They usually have well-intentioned staff that will advise you and help you to resolve any difficulties. So if you have a question, you can just reach out to the journal and ask them. You can always write to the editorial office. Sometimes they will even agree to meet you on Zoom and tell you how to do things, how to format your revision, how to deal with conflicts of interest or whatever. You know, they're there to help. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask them if you need guidance during the revision process. That was everything I had to say about revisions. So we have a few minutes still for questions. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen so that we can talk. If anybody has any questions about the whole publication process. I'll send the slides to your leader so that they can be shared with you. Yes, Clarence.
Hi, Fiona. Thank you for your very systematic slides. It's very helpful for me. I want to ask one question. Like recently, I submitted a Congress paper and it was accepted.
Well
but I think this work can be further improved. Like later, perhaps I want to improve it and submit to a journal.
Yeah.
So, but the work between the Congress paper and the journal paper must be overlapped. But how much is the overlapping area? I want to ask some suggestions from you.
Okay, well, most journals, when you submit, they will do a plagiarism check. So, for example, in my geriatrics journal, when I get assigned a submission from the editorial office, there has already been a plagiarism check, and it may show a red flag. It may show like that there's 50% overlap. But if I see that that's a preprint or conference proceedings, then I disregard that, because you are allowed to republish an article in a journal after publishing in a congress. You cannot publish in another journal. But if you have published a preprint on a preprint server, or if you have published conference proceedings, an abstract or a paper in a conference, that's okay. That's not a problem. So if there's overlap, that's okay. Especially if you say in the cover letter to the editor when you submit to the journal, this paper was presented at the European Congress of XYZ in Paris in 2024. That's okay. So overlap with a previous presentation in a conference is usually not a problem for most journals.
Okay, thank you.
Olga?
Yes, my question is, what if I have very unclear reviews? Because my supervisors, they like to write something like, it's unclear, or I don't understand what you're talking about, or something like this, and I always don't know what to reply or what to change, because for me it's clear and I understand what I'm talking about. So, I mean, sometimes there are some comments which are not very useful and understandable, and I don't know how I'm supposed to react and not to make it worse.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, sometimes reviewers do make comments that don't give you any indication of what they want you to change. So what I would suggest there is, for example, if you give it to a colleague or a friend or somebody in your field and say, okay, when you read this, what do you understand? And they will say, well, I understand that you killed 25 mice. And you say, okay, no, that was not what I was trying to do. My main message was this. And you say, did you understand this? And just compare. When somebody reads it, do they understand what you were trying to say? And if not, then you need to rephrase. So you can change the formulation. Sometimes you can just, if you don't know or you can't find anybody to give you feedback, you can just say the same thing in a different way. Stick it in ChatGPT and ask them to rephrase it. And then just put in a different sentence that says basically the same thing. Maybe the reviewer will find a different formulation more easy to understand. Sometimes when you don't know what to do, you can also just say, well, we have rephrased for greater clarity. If the reviewer still finds it unclear, we would be grateful for specific guidance about how to reformulate. Then you're asking them to tell you exactly, well, what do you want me to say? Sometimes you can just bounce the ball back to them and say, we've rephrased, we hope it's better. If it's still not found to be satisfactory, then we remain open to making any or following any specific indications for change. That means you're putting the ball in their camp, asking them to tell you exactly what should I reformulate here, okay? You can also, in that case, say to the editor, some of the comments from the reviewer were unclear, unhelpful, and don't give specific guidance for change, so we were unable to make extensive revisions because we didn't know what they wanted us to change. That's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Well, if nobody else has any questions, we can finish up there. I will send you the slides in any case, okay? And I'll put my email address on the first slide. If you have questions at any time, well, not in the next 2 weeks because I'm going on vacation, but after that, feel free to send me your questions by email. There's no, there's no expiry date. The lesson is today, but you're welcome to contact me at any time if you have questions, you don't know what to do, you have a problem, just write, okay? I don't intend to change jobs. I should be at the same email address, so feel free, reach out, and I will answer your questions, okay?
Thank you.
No problem, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Yes.
Thank you. Have a nice vacation.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Enjoy your holiday.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Have a nice weekend.